patria o muerte.
Episode 6, The Ultramarine Ghost. 1. The Submerged Architecture. History does not disappear. It submerges. What most people call the past is not gone, it is compressed, folded, and buried beneath layers of newer narratives that declare themselves final. We walk on top of it, oblivious, like pedestrians on a modern street unaware of the catacombs beneath their feet. But when systems destabilize, when the present can no longer explain itself, the ground cracks. History resurfaces, not as memory, but as structure. This is where the empires of the 21st century make their first serious mistake. They believe history is linear. They believe that time is an arrow flying straight toward a horizon of their own making. They assume that what comes next must resemble what came before, only larger, faster, and more violent. They prepare for the next war by studying the last one. They search the archives for warnings. They do not search them for unused solutions. But in the quiet corners of the world, where the noise of the news cycle fades, some are beginning to dig. They are brushing the dust off an old, discarded model. The Ultramarine Empire. Or rather, its ghost. 2. The network before the Internet. Portuguese Empire is usually remembered in the Anglosphere as a footnote. In the grand textbooks written in London or New York, it is a brief prelude, a small European power that arrived early, expanded rapidly, and declined just as quickly into irrelevance. It is caricatured as an empire of caravels, sugar, slavery, and decay. A primitive stumbling block before the real empires, the British, the Spanish, the French, arrived to modernize the world. This is a caricature. And like all caricatures, it hides a complex truth. What actually existed was something far stranger, and far more relevant to the present moment than any British gunboat or Roman legion. Portugal did not build a contiguous empire. It did not paint a continent one color. It did not march armies across the plains of India or the jungles of Brazil to occupy every square mile. It couldn't. Portugal lacked the population. It lacked the armies. It lacked the strategic depth to dominate landmasses. It was a tiny sliver of land on the edge of Europe, staring out at a terrifying, endless ocean. So, out of sheer necessity, it did something no empire before it had fully attempted. It built a network. It treated the ocean not as a barrier, but as connective tissue. Lisbon governed territories it could not march to. Brazil was ruled across an ocean that took months to cross. Africa was administered through nodes, ports, forts, trading posts, rather than conquest lines. Ultramarine is not poetic language. It is technical. Ultramar meant beyond the sea, but politically, it meant something radical. It meant that sovereignty could exist without territorial continuity. It meant that an empire could function as a distributed system. It meant that distance could be managed administratively, not erased militarily. This is the part history books gloss over because it does not fit the nationalist storytelling of the 19th and 20th centuries. The nation-state is obsessed with borders, with contiguity, with the sacred soil. The ultramarine model didn't care about soil, it cared about the root. But in the age of satellites, fiber optics, and instantaneous coordination, this model stops looking archaic. It starts looking prophetic. 3. The compatibility of fragments. The ultramarine system created a prototype for globalization long before the word existed. It built a shared administrative language. A common legal framework. Integrated trade circuits that moved gold, spices, and unfortunately, human beings, with a terrifying efficiency. It created interoperable elites who could move from Goa to Luanda to Salvador to Macau and understand the rules of the game. Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé, Goa, Macau, these were not colonies in the modern sense of a resource colony meant only to be drained. They were modules. Imperfect. Exploitative. Violent. Undeniably brutal. But modular. And when Portugal declined, when the political center in Lisbon rotted away, the modules did not disappear. They persisted as fragments. Languages survived. Legal codes endured. Administrative cultures lingered. Trade instincts remained aligned. Even today, A lawyer in Sao Paulo can understand a contract written in Luanda more intuitively than one written in New York. A poet in Maputo shares a grammatical soul with a writer in Lisbon. The empire died. The network did not. Hidden history matters because power is not only about force, it is about compatibility. Force conquers, but compatibility endures. Compatibility is what allows a system to reboot after a crash. This is what the modern empires fail to see. The United States sees Latin America as territory to be fenced off. China sees Africa as infrastructure to be built and owned. Russia sees Europe as a buffer space to be neutralized. All of them treat regions as objects. Inert matter to be molded by the will of the strong. The ultramarine ghost treats them as components. This distinction is everything. Because objects are passive. Components are active. Components can be recombined. Territory must be held with guns. A network is held by protocols. 4. The architect's diagnosis. The woman who begins to appear in diplomatic cables at this point does not look like a revolutionary. She does not wear fatigues. She does not shout from balconies. She wears tailored suits. She carries a tablet. She speaks in the hushed, precise tones of high-level administration. Her background is not military. It is legal. Historical. She is a student of governance failure. She knows why federations break and why treaties rot. She understands that the modern world is no longer governed by who has the biggest army. That is a 20th century metric. The 21st century will be governed by who can coordinate complexity at scale. Global South thinkers had long suspected this. They knew the game was rigged. But suspicion is not power. Power requires articulation. It requires a plan. She articulates it. In closed-door meetings in Brasilia, in secret summits in Lagos, in quiet dinners in Lisbon, she frames the emerging tripolar order not as a war, but as a compression event. 3 empires are squeezing the rest of the world, she tells the gathered ministers and diplomats. They are not doing it maliciously. They are doing it structurally. They are expanding to fill the vacuum. And when pressure increases, matter changes phase. Solids fracture. Liquids flow. Gases dissipate. But networks, she says, tapping the screen where the map of the South Atlantic glows, networks adapt. Her insight is brutally simple, and it cuts through the patriotic rhetoric of every nation in the room. Africa, Latin America, and Southern Europe are not weak because they are poor. They are weak because they are separate. Each lacks one of the 3 critical dimensions of survival. Africa has demographics, youth, and resources, minerals, but lacks capital stability. It is rich in potential, poor in liquidity. Latin America has resources, food, energy, and population, but lacks strategic autonomy. It is trapped in the gravitational pull of the North. Southern Europe has institutional memory, legal frameworks, and market access, but lacks scale. It is shrinking, aging, and becoming a museum. Individually, they are prey. They are bargaining chips to be traded by Washington, Beijing, and Moscow. Together, they form a system with demographic mass that dwarfs the West, resource depth that rivals the East, cultural interoperability born of centuries of contact, strategic redundancy, if one node falls, the others survive, oceanic reach that controls the Atlantic. In other words, a fourth pole. Fourth superpower is not an aspiration. It is an emergent property. It is physics. 5. The dangerous proposal. But emergence requires alignment. And alignment requires something radical. It requires a willingness to abandon the nation-state as the primary unit of survival. This is where the idea becomes dangerous. This is where the generals in the room shift uncomfortably in their chairs. This is where the politicians frown. Because she is challenging everything they think they are protecting. Flags. Anthems. Borders. Sacred histories of independence. The myths that men have died for. But the empires have already discarded these when convenient, she reminds them gently. When the US wants something, sovereignty is a suggestion. When China wants a port, local law is an obstacle. They have moved beyond the nation-state. They are civilizations acting as predators. She simply admits it publicly. The ultramarine proposal says what others imply. That sovereignty is no longer viable below a certain scale. That clinging to it is not resistance, it is suicide. This is why the idea terrifies existing powers. Not because it is aggressive, it doesn't threaten to invade Texas or Siberia. But because it is orthogonal. It moves in a different direction entirely. It does not contest their borders. It renders them irrelevant. Decolonization is usually framed as fragmentation, breaking the empire into tiny, independent pieces. This is its unfinished phase. Recomposition. Not under Europe, neocolonialism. Not under America, hegemony. Not under China, debt diplomacy. But under a structure born from shared historical entanglement and future necessity. 6. The Commonwealth of Survival. The proposal circulating quietly is not called an empire. That word is too loaded, too stained with blood. It is called a Commonwealth of Survival. It promises things that sound utopian but are described with the dryness of a contract. Shared governance, a parliament of regions, not nations. Distributed capitals, power that rotates, ensuring no single city dominates. Unified defense doctrine, a porcupine strategy of denial rather than projection. Internal freedom of movement, labor and talent flowing like water. Collective economic planning, resource sovereignty enforced by a cartel of the whole. But it also demands something unprecedented. Something that makes the religious leaders in the room go pale. Total ideological neutrality. No state religion. No cultural supremacy. No historical veto. History is acknowledged, she says, but not obeyed. This is the most radical element. Because religion, nationalism, and myth are the primary fault lines empires exploit. They use Sunni against Shia, Catholic against Protestant, black against white, tribe against tribe. They pry open these cracks to insert their leverage. Remove the cracks, she argues, and the system stabilizes. Secular state in her proposal is not a philosophical preference. It is a survival constraint. Atheism is not proposed as a belief system. It is proposed as an administrative necessity. Faith becomes private. Law becomes universal. Education becomes secular by force of survival. This is not utopian. It is ruthless. It tells the bishop, the imam, and the pastor, you have no seat at this table. Your truths are too small for this survival. And this ruthlessness is precisely why it might work. Future history rarely belongs to the gentle. It belongs to those who can make the hard cuts. 7. The irony of return. What makes the ultramarine ghost so powerful is that it does not promise salvation. It does not promise heaven on earth. It promises endurance. It promises that your grandchildren will speak your language, even if your flag is gone. It does not erase culture. It suspends its capacity to fracture the whole. Critics call it authoritarian. You are erasing our identity, they cry. Supporters call it inevitable. We are erasing our vulnerability, they reply. But everyone understands one thing. If it succeeds, the tripolar trap collapses. Because the triangle loses its center. The Atlantic becomes a unified space, not a barrier. The South becomes coordinated, not chaotic. The extraction model breaks because the resource basin has closed its gates. China cannot absorb what is integrated. Russia cannot buffer what is distributed. The United States cannot dominate what does not fragment. This is why intelligence agencies begin to pay attention. This is why think tanks in DC quietly commission historical studies on 16th-century Portuguese naval logistics. This is why diplomatic language starts shifting from partnerships to integration. This is why the woman's name begins appearing in risk assessments with a red tag. She is not charismatic. She does not give speeches that make people weep. She is precise. She speaks in survival curves. And she understands the final, delicious irony. That the empires racing to divide the world, building walls, firing missiles, hoarding oil, are unknowingly recreating the conditions that once allowed a much smaller power to connect it. The Portuguese ultramarine empire was born from limitation. It was born because Portugal was too small to conquer the land, so it conquered the sea. This new one will be born from extinction risk. It will be born because the nations are too small to survive the giants, so they will become a giant themselves. The ghost has fully surfaced now. It is no longer a historical curiosity. It is a blueprint. And the next chapter will no longer be theoretical. Because the moment an idea becomes structurally necessary, when the alternative is death, it stops being optional.